Apple is number one on Fortune's most admired company list. Steve Jobs describes Apple as the biggest startup on the planet. But Apple is not the only big company to run like a startup. Starbucks, DreamWorks Animation, and J.Crew are all run like startups. It sounds simple, but CEOs must work diligently to create an environment where ideas dominate over tenure or hierarchy. It's no simple task. When Jobs returned to Apple after a decade in exile, it was 90 days from bankruptcy. Apple develops products that people can't get enough of, but it's also a brutal and unforgiving place where accountability is strictly enforced, decisions are swift, and communication is articulated clearly from the top. How do they do it? Apple is an organization that accepts no excuses from executives, has a culture of responsibility, holds individuals accountable, employees believe they're part of a unified team, executives share where Apple is headed, and develop members so that they are able to present to Jobs himself. Like any startup, Apple is risk tolerant. It's willing to release products to test markets. In 2001, when Apple released the iPod, critics said it was expensive and incompatible with Windows. In 2008, Apple released Mobile Me, an email system that was supposed to provide the seamless synchronization features that corporate users love about their BlackBerry smartphones. Unfortunately, Mobile Me users complained about lost emails and spotty syncing. In the summer of 2008, Apple launched its first iPhone. In 2011, the phone is already being released in 21 more countries with prices in the upper limits of $1,800 US. As we just mentioned, Apple is risk tolerant, but also accepts no excuses and has a culture of responsibility. When released in 2008, users loved the new iPhone, but Mobile Me service did not perform as expected. Steve Jobs was upset. Shortly after the launch event, he gathered the Mobile Me team. Jobs walked in dressed in his black mock turtleneck and blue jeans and asked if anyone could tell him what Mobile Me was supposed to do. After listening to the answers, he responded, "So why the bleep doesn't it do that? You should hate each other for letting each other down. Mossberg is no longer writing good things about us." Afterwards, he named a new executive to run the group. Much of the team disbanded, and those left behind eventually turned Mobile Me into the service Jobs demanded. Time and again, Appleites describe a company that behaves like a cutting-edge startup. It's unknown whether Apple's ways are sustainable or the sheer will of Steve Jobs. The answer will be determined by the future of Apple, but every conversation about Apple eventually comes around to Steve Jobs. Startups tend to be personified by their founders. When you think of Apple, you immediately think of Steve Jobs. Jobs is behind most of its innovations, operations, product designs, and all of the company divisions. The employees of Apple are constantly prepared to be one's boss or one's boss's boss for a presentation to Steve Jobs himself. He's a corporate dictator who makes every critical decision. Jobs' mission is to turn those things that are inherently Stevian, attention to detail, secrecy, constant feedback, into processes that ensure Apple's excellence far into the future. One metaphor he uses is the difference between the janitor and the vice president. In this parable, Steve describes the garbage can not being regularly emptied in his office. In conversations with the janitor, he gets an excuse such as, "I don't have a key." Janitors get to explain why something happened. Senior people do not. Somewhere between the janitor and CEO, reasons stop mattering. Jobs creates a culture of responsibility by hosting weekly meetings which set the rhythm for the company. On Monday, they review the whole business. On Wednesday, they hold marketing and communication meetings. There is never any confusion as to who is responsible. Their name is on the action list as the directly responsible individual. Corporations are familiar with the org chart, with lines and matrices. Apple doesn't have committees, and management is frowned upon. Only the CFO has responsibility for costs that lead to profit and loss. Apple labels profit and loss as a distraction. They believe they're a unified team. This strategy allows for a constant course correction. One of Apple's greatest strengths is focusing on a few things. Jobs talks about the power of picking the things you don't do. You can ask anyone in the company what Steve wants, and you'll get an answer, even though most of them have never met him. There are, however, 100 employees that do know Jobs. Every year or so, Jobs takes 100 Appleites for an intense 3-day strategy meeting. The meeting is shrouded in secrecy. People are not to put it on their calendars. They're not to discuss their participation. They must ride a bus which departs from their headquarters to an undisclosed meeting room that's been swept for electronic bugs. Participation in one of these meetings does not, however, guarantee a future at Apple. The meeting is simply used to inform the group on where Apple is headed. Apple is a startup at heart, but not when comparing its $66 billion in the bank. Apple has cash, but unlike Google, there's no free lunch at Apple. Apple's scarce resources is related to finding enough people to perform critical tasks. Jobs sees specialization as a function of having the best-in-class employees. This environment would appear to be a difficult workplace. Turnover, however, is especially low. Apple employees are seen as privileged to work for the company that's making the coolest product. So, what are Apple's plans for the future? In 2008, Jobs hired the dean of Yale School of Management to head Apple University. Their first project was to write a series of internal case studies about significant decisions in Apple's recent history. Top managers at Apple will teach the cases. The goal is to expose the next layer of management to the thoughts of its top executives. How does the biggest startup on the planet work? Apple develops products that people can't get enough of. CEOs work diligently to create an environment where ideas dominate. It's an organization that accepts no excuses from executives, has a culture of responsibility, holds individuals accountable. Employees are convinced they are part of a unified team. Executives share where Apple is headed and develop members so that they're able to present to Jobs himself.